Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Aaron Bulma here, serving as military specialist for Carleton County. I'm going to do another war history presentation, part of the World War II timeline tonight. This one is I'm going to go over to the Pacific theater of war, leading up to the Second World War for Japan. So, in the European front, right now, I've got up to the start of 1941. I want to get as far as 1940 with this here going through the 30s, through the First World War, the 1900s, up until at least 1940, 1941. And that's what I'm planning on doing here. So it's Aaron Boma, military specialist for Carleton County. So Imperial Japan. This is the Imperial Japanese flag, the flag of the rising sun. So the Empire of Japan was a historical nation state that existed from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 until the enactment of the post-Second World War 1947 Constitution and subsequent formation of modern Japan. It encompassed the Japanese archipelago and several colonies, protectorates, mandates, and other territories. Under the slogans Fukoku Koryei, and Shokuzan Kogo, Japan underwent a period of industrialization and militarization. The Meiji Restoration being the fastest modernization of any country to date. All of these aspects contributed to Japan's emergence as a great power and the establishment of a colonial empire following the First Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Russian-Japanese War, and World War One. The economic and political turmoil in the 1920s, including the Great Depression, led to the rise of militarism, nationalism, and totalitarianism, eventually culminating in Japan's membership in the Axis Alliance and the conquest of a large part of the Asia Pacific in the Second World War. Here, some of the soldiers here. I believe these are from the First World War era. Um, so the rifles they had from were Arisaka Type 30s, Type 38s, and then eventually Arisaka Type 99s, bolt action rifles, 7.7 millimeter. Um, I'll get into a lot of that different stuff. And okay, all right. So Japan's armed forces initially achieved large-scale military successes during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937-1945, and the Pacific War. However, starting from 1942, particularly after the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan was forced to adopt a defensive stance, and the American island hopping campaign meant that Japan was slowly losing all of the territory it had gained, and eventually the Americans captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa Island, leaving the Japanese mainland completely unprotected. And this is what's to come later on in different presentations. It's going to be much more broken down. The US forces had planned an invasion, but Japan surrendered following the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 9th, 1945, and subsequent invasion of Manchuria and other territories, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Pacific War officially came to a close on the 2nd of September 1945. The period of occupation by the Allies followed. 1947, with American involvement, a new constitution was enacted, officially bringing the Empire of Japan to an end, and Japan's Imperial Army was replaced with the Japan Self-Defense Forces, which is what it is today. Occupation and Reconstruction continued until 1952, eventually forming the current constitutional monarchy known as Japan. The Empire of Japan had three emperors, although it came to an end during Showa's reign, and which is, of course, Emperor Hirohito. The emperors were given posthumous names, and the emperors are as follows: Emperor Meiji, 1867 to 1912; Motosido, Emperor Taisho, 1912 to 1926; Yoshihito, and Emperor Showa, 1926 to 1989. That would be Hirohito. Here are some, I believe these are Japanese pilots. an honor guard salute. Um, so this is just the start of this presentation. So going into World War One. So Japan entered World War One on the side of the Allies in 1914, seizing the opportunity of Germany's distraction with the European war to expand its sphere of influence in China and the Pacific. Japan declared war on Germany on August 23, 1914. Japanese and allied British Empire forces soon moved to occupy Tsingtao Fortress, the German East Asia and Marshall Islands in the Pacific, which were part of the German New Guinea area. The swift invasion in the German territory of Taisho Bay Concession and the siege of Tsingtao proved successful. The German colonial troops surrendered on 7th of November 1914, and Japan gained the German holdings. With Western allies, notably the United Kingdom, heavily involved in the war in Europe, Japan dispatched a naval fleet to the Mediterranean Sea to aid Allied shipping. Japan sought further to consolidate its position in China by presenting the 21 demands to China in January 1915. In the face of slow negotiations with the Chinese government, widespread anti-Japanese sentiment in China, and international condemnation, Japan withdrew the final group of demands and treaties were signed in May 1915. The Anglo-Japanese alliance was renewed and expanded in scope twice, in 1905 and in 1911. Before its demise in 1921, it was officially terminated in 1923. So the Siberian Intervention, after the fall of the Tsar's regime in Russia and the later provisional regime in 1917, the new Bolshevik government signed a separate peace treaty with Germany. After this, various factions that succeeded the Russian Empire fought amongst themselves in a multi-sided civil war. In July 1918, President Wilson in the United States asked the Japanese government to supply 7,000 troops as part of an international coalition of 25,000 troops planned to support the American Expeditionary Force Siberia. Prime Minister Teraki Masateki agreed to send 12,000 troops, but under the Japanese command rather than as part of an international coalition. So, rather than international, they put them under Japanese command. The Japanese had several hidden motives for the venture, which included an intense hostility and fear of communism, a determination to recoup historical losses to Russia, and the desire to settle the northern problem in Japan's security, either through the creation of a buffer state or through outright territorial acquisition. By November 1918, more than 70,000 Japanese troops under Chief of Staff Iemitsu had occupied all ports and major towns in the Russian maritime provinces and eastern Siberia. Japan received 765 Polish orphans from Siberia. In June 1920, around 450 Japanese civilians, 350 Japanese soldiers, along with Russian White Army supporters, were massacred by partisan forces associated with the Red Army at Nikolaevsk on the Amur River. The United States and its allied coalition partners consequently withdrew from Vladivostok after the capture and execution of White Army leader Admiral Alexander Kolchak by the Red Army. However, the Japanese decided to stay, primarily due to fears of the spread of communism so close to Japan and Japanese-controlled Korea and Manchuria. The Japanese army provided military support to the Japanese-backed provisional Premier government based in Vladivostok against the Moscow-backed Far Eastern Republic. The continued Japanese presence concerned the United States, which suspected that Japan had territorial designs on Siberia and the Russian Far East. Subjected to intense diplomatic pressure by the United States and the United Kingdom, and facing increasing domestic opposition due to the economic and human cost, the administration of Prime Minister Kato um, T- Tomoyasu withdrew the Japanese forces on in October 1922. Japanese casualties from the expedition were 5,000 dead from combat or illness, with the expedition costing over 900 million yen. Amazing. So here's some of the weapons here. Type 3, Hotchkiss M1914, that's French. Um, Here's the what they well some people call it samurai sword. It's their that is their of course that's a ceremonial sword um, for officers and uh, Gunto. You see those even on Japanese officers in the Second World War, of course. Um, Flag bearers and whatnot, and as they're doing the bonsai charge, and if they're gunned down, souvenirs have been brought back. I actually have an authentic Japanese 1944 Imperial Japanese Navy flag from my museum, and so Type 26 pistol, Komaru, which is another sidearm they have, and the Nambu, the Type 14 Nambu, or Type A. This one being Type A is very similar. So these were designed in 1902, and there was Type A, Type B, and Type 14. I built a Type 14 model before. They're 7 point something millimeter, over 10,300 built, 400,000 Type 14s built. Um, they are in cartridges, so they're 8 times 22 millimeter Nambu cartridges. So um, it's real recoil spring action, effective firing range 50 meters. Feed system is an 8 box round internal magazine, so that fits in the bottom. There you have. Sorry, I just had the cats. So here we have the Arisaka Type 30 that I mentioned. So it's a bolt action 5 round, has a 5 round internal clip, fits in. Designed in 1897. These over 500,000 were built. The carbines, like the Arisaka carbines, over 45,000 were built. These are 6.550 Arisaka. Um, they can also be chambered in 303 British, 6.554 Manchurian Schnauer, and of course they're bolt action. So just like the Car 98 that I mentioned, they are a standard 5 round internal, have a standard 5 round internal clip, and it fits in. And they're roughly, they can shoot up to 500, 600 yards or more. Um, these were used throughout the war periods, through the Second World War, even after the Second World War. So these were used all through. Um, and this is just an introduction to some of the infantry weapons used by the Japanese military, Imperial Japanese Army, and Imperial Japanese Navy Marine Corps as well. Um, so this is just a few of them here. So Maruda Type 18, Type 38, Arisaka Type 38 carbine, Type 44 carbine, um, or Type 38 rifle. So Type 44 carbine, Type 35, and eventually they'll be, and of course for the Second World War they'll have the um, Type 99, which is the standard, um, becomes the standard bolt action rifle of the Japanese army. It is, and I've fired them. It even has some, the iron sights can flip up for anti-aircraft use. Um, Japanese rifles have a long, large bayonet that is fitted on them, and those bayonets are part of what really makes the Japanese military weapons, in a sense, very unique because they're very long. I mean, in that instance, but they're very menacing. I mean, when you don't see Japanese troops coming through the jungle, um, a lot of times they're charging bonsai charges at you, wave after wave, with fixed bayonets, and so they're well disciplined and well trained, and they can live for weeks on a small packet of rice, and that's the discipline of the Japanese soldier. It's impressive. This is Emperor Taisho. the 123rd Emperor of Japan. So after the fall of the Tsarist regime, of course, so okay, this is more just of the stuff I had talked about. So, Taisho Democracy, the two-party political system that had been developing in Japan since the turn of the century came of age after World War One, giving rise to the nickname for the period Taisho Democracy. The public grew disillusioned with the growing national debt, and the new election laws, which retained the old minimum tax qualifications for voters. Calls were raised for universal suffrage and the dismantling of the old political party network. Students, university professors, and journalists, bolstered by labor unions and inspired by a variety of democratic, socialist, communist, anarchist, and other thoughts, mounted large but orderly public demonstrations in favor of universal male suffrage in 1919 and 1920. The election of Kedo Komai as Prime Minister of Japan continued democratic reforms that had been advocated by influential individuals on the left, culminated in the passage of universal male suffrage in March 1925. This bill gave all male subjects over the age of 25 the right to vote, provided they had lived in their electoral districts for at least 1 year and were not homeless. The electorate thereby increased from 3.3 million to 12.5 million. So the expansion of democracy. In 1932, Park Chung-kum was elected to the House of Representatives in the Japanese general election as the person elected from a colonial background. In 1935, democracy was introduced in Taiwan, and in response to Taiwanese public opinion, local assemblies were established. In 1942, 38 colonial people were elected to local assemblies of the Japanese homeland. Amazing. Overall, during the 1920s, Japan changed its direction towards a democratic system of government. However, parliamentary government was not rooted deeply enough to withstand the economic and political pressures of the 1930s, during which military leaders became increasingly influential. These shifts in power were made possible by the ambiguity and imprecision of the Meiji Constitution, particularly as regarded the position of the emperor in relation to the Constitution. So Japanese militarism, and that's one thing that's we're going to cover here. It really begins to rise in these, but has been rising for years. The military had a strong influence on Japanese society from the Meiji Restoration. Almost all leaders in Japanese society during the Meiji period, whether in the military, politics, or business, were ex-samurai or descendants of samurai, and shared a set of values and outlooks. The early Meiji government viewed Japan as threatened by Western imperialism, and one of the prime motivations for the Fukoku Koryei policy was to strengthen Japan's economic and industrial foundation so that a strong military could be built to defend Japan against outside powers. The rise of universal military conscription, introduced by Yamagata Aritomo in 1873, along with the proclamation of the Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors in 1882, enabled the military to indoctrinate thousands of men from various social backgrounds with military patriotic values and the concept of unquestioning loyalty to the emperor as the basis of the Japanese state. Kokutai. Yamagata, like many Japanese, was strongly influenced by the recent striking success of Prussia in transforming itself from an agricultural state to a leading modern industrial and military power. Yep. He accepted Prussian political ideas, German, which favored military expansion abroad and authoritarian government at home. The Prussian model also devalued the notion of civilian control over the independent military, which meant that in Japan, as in Germany, the military could develop in a state within a state, thus exercising greater influence on politics in general. And that's exactly what happened in Japan during the Second World War. Um, the prime minister, of course, well, that'd be Tojo during the war. The emperor was a figurehead, but the military themselves controlled the country, and not for the better. Um, Civilian leadership did its own control, but the military had control over basically everything else, production as far as and where to go. They made the decisions, not the political sphere. It's mainly the military pushing the political sphere to go where to go and how to do it. So here's another picture. Is a picture of a Chinese soldier. It looks like he's been captured. So I'm going to talk about the invasion. Invasion of Manchuria, Shanghai. I'm going to talk about incursions in China and following the German victory in the Franco-Prussian War, the Army Staff College and the Japanese General Staff paid close attention to Major Meckel's views on the superiority of the German military model over the French system as the reason for German victory. In response to a Japanese request, Prussian Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke uh, Gekkokugen. Um, so in Japan, Meckel worked closely with future prime ministers General Kitsuraturo and General Yakigama Aritomo, with the army strategist General Kawakami Soroku. So, all right, Soroku. Meckel made numerous recommendations which were implemented, including reorganization of the command structure of the army into divisions and regiments, thus increasing mobility, strengthening the army logistics and transportation structure with the major army bases connected by railways, establishing artillery and engineering regiments as independent commands, and revising the universal conscription system to abolish universal to abolish virtually all exceptions. All exceptions. Wow. A bust of a bust of Mego was sighted in front of the Japanese Army Staff College from 1900 from 1909 through 1945. So the the uh, the the Japanese are taking key operating procedures from the Germans, from the Prussians, and how to set up their military as a military society, and being able to be militaristic, nationalistic, the way that the Japanese see the Germans. And so the Japanese are now becoming a major industrial state, but with a militarized state with its own military society, set up in similar ways that Germany, imperialist Germany, would become and was at the time, or what they call Prussia in the Prussian times. So, talking more about the independence of the military. Also forming part of the basis for the growth of militarism was the freedom of civilian control enjoyed by the Japanese armed forces. In 1878, the Imperial Japanese Army established the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff Office, modeled after the German General Staff. This office was independent of and equal and later superior to the Ministry of War of Japan in terms of authority, in terms of overall control. The Imperial Japanese Navy soon followed with the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff. These general staff offices were responsible for the planning and execution of military operations and reported directly to the emperor. Now, the chiefs of the general staff were not cabinet ministers. They did not report to the prime minister of Japan and were thus completely independent of any civilian oversight or control. So the army and the navy also had a decisive say on the formation and survival of any civilian government, since the law required that the posts of army minister and navy minister be filled by active duty officers nominated by their respective services. And since the law had required that a prime minister resign if he could not fill all of his cabinet posts, both the Army and Navy had final say on the formation of a cabinet and could bring down the cabinet at any time by withdrawing their minister and refusing to nominate a successor. This footage here is some of of course, Japan's militarism talk in the 1930s, and some of these people I'm directly covering in this presentation. Um, so, in reality, while this tactic was used only one time, ironically, to prevent a general, um, Yugaki from becoming prime minister in 1937, the threat always loomed large when the military made any demands on the civilian leadership. So, this is, of course, a map of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which is in 1931. So, Japanese territory as of 1928, you can see here, has all the Koreas. Um, the Koreans themselves were very much persuaded not to speak Korean, but to speak Japanese. Japan would always force any what they call inferior races to conform to their ideology in support of the emperor, and that every other race was considered inferior. And that was certainly the truth with its operations in the Second World War, of how it treated colonies from the New Guineas to all the way from French Indochina and the Netherlands, East Indies, and beyond. So this is the invasion, which takes much of Manchuria, Manchukuo, in 1931. See up here, you can see area from Vladivostok here, Mukden. So this is what we call the Mukden Incident, what we're coming up with here. So expansionism. During the Taisho period, Japan saw a short period of democratic rule, the so-called Taisho Democracy, and several diplomatic attempts were made to encourage peace, such as the Washington Naval Treaty, with participation in the League of Nations. However, with the beginning of the Showa era, which is Hirohito, the apparent collapse of the world economic order with the Great Depression starting in 1929, coupled with the imposition of trade barriers by Western nations and an increasing radicalism in Japanese politics, including issues of domestic terrorist violence, including an assassination attempt on the emperor in 1932. I believe that was the February 26th incident, and a number of attempted coups d'etats by ultra-nationalist secret societies led to a resurgence of so-called Tinjoistic patriotism, a weakening of democratic forces, and a belief that the military could solve all threats, both domestic and foreign. Patriotic education also strengthened the sense of a heko ichiu, or a divine mission to unify Asia under Japanese rule. And before the Second World War, from 1931, 1932 to 1937 and 38, the invasion of Shanghai and further areas, including the capture of the Chinese capital of Peking at the time, which was Beijing today, um, and of course the Second World War coming into play in December 1941 with Japan. This was certainly what Japan was pushing for, which was to take control of all of Asia at the time, and it was slowly working up to that goal. Those who continued to resist the military solution, including nationalists with unquestionable patriotism, such as Generals Jotaro Watanabe and Tetsuzan Nagata, and Foreign Minister Kijiro Shidenhara were driven from office or an active role in the government. A turning point came with the ratification of the London Naval Treaty of 1930. Prime Minister Osashi Hamaguchi and his Minseto party agreed to a treaty which would severely limit Japanese naval power. This treaty was strongly opposed by the military, who claimed that it would endanger national defense, and was portrayed by the opposition, Riken, which is one of them being the opposition, Riken Sayukai, the Riken Sayukai party, as having been forced upon Japan by a hostile United States, which further inflamed growing anti-foreign sentiment, which certainly is building up. Um, the Japanese system of party governance finally met with its demise with the May 15th incident in 1932, when a group of junior naval officers and army cadets assassinated Prime Minister Inuke uh, Tsuyoshi. Although the assassins were put on a trial and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, they were seen properly as having acted out of patriotism, and the atmosphere was set where the military was able to act with little restraint. Japan had been involved in the Asia continent continuously from the First Sino-Japanese War, Boxer Rebellion, Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and the Siberian Intervention in 1917. During the term of Prime Minister Tanaka Gishi from 1927 to 1929, Japan sent troops 3 times to China to obstruct Chiang Kai-shek's unification campaign. In June 1928, adventurous officers of the Kuomintang Army embarked on unauthorized initiatives to protect Japanese interests in Manchuria, including the assassination of a former ally, warlord Zhang Julin, in hopes of sparking a general conflict. The Manchurian Incident of September 1931 did not fail, and it set the stage for the Japanese military takeover of all of Manchuria. Kuomintang Army conspirators blew up a few meters of South Manchurian Railway Company track near Mukden, calling it the Mukden Incident, blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used the event as an excuse to invade and seize the vast territory. In Tokyo, 1 month later, in the Imperial Colors Incident, military figures failed in an attempt to establish a military dictatorship, but again the news was suppressed and the military perpetrators were not punished. Here's some naval officers here. In January 1932, Japanese forces attacked Shanghai in the First Shanghai Incident, waging a 3-month undeclared war there before a truce was reached. The civilian government in Tokyo was powerless to prevent these military adventures. Instead of being condemned, the Kuomintang Army's actions enjoyed considerable popular support. Unike's successors, military men chosen by Seonjae Kinmochi, the last surviving general, recognized Manchukuo, and that which is what the Japanese at the time called Manchuria, and generally approved the army's actions in securing Manchuria as an industrial base, an area for Japanese immigration, and a potential staging ground for war with the Soviet Union. Various army factions contended for power amid increasing suppression of dissent and more assassinations. In the February 26th incident of 1936, okay, that's where that comes in. The Army's elite 1st Infantry Division staged an attempted coup d'etat in yet another effort to overthrow civilian rule. The revolt was put down by other military units, and its leaders were executed after secret trials. Despite public dismay over these events and the discredit they brought to numerous military figures, Japan's civilian leadership capitulated to the army's demands in hopes of ending domestic violence. Increases were seen in defense budgets, naval construction. Japan announced it would no longer accede to disarmament treaties, and patriotic indoctrination as Japan moved toward a wartime footing. Here's Emperor Hirohito, I believe, here. So this is in September 1931. September 18th, 1941. They invade Manchuria. Other military ventures, of course, once they have taken power, once the military has taken power in Japan. July 7th, 1937, they invade and take Beijing. August 13th, 1937, they take Shanghai. The Japanese Navy is building battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, naval aviation. The Imperial Japanese Air Force has always been one of the best in the world since from the 1930s and then 40s on to going in through to the Second World War. Eventually, they will have 9 and then 11 aircraft carriers. To the American 3 aircraft carriers in 1941. Um, so further invasions will be French Indochina and Philippines after the Second World War has begun. Netherlands, East Indies, all the way down to almost Australia, Papua New Guinea. Definitely. So Hainsan is taken in 1939. See, acquisition of these are additional occupations until 1937, 1938, and then 1940 and to 42. So 1942 is when they take the Philippines. So remember December 7th, 1941, which is the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that, and we will come to much more in depth on this later on. After that, they soon in early 1942 they invade the Philippines, and then they occupy zones, um, additional occupation, and of course that's until 1942. So they've occupied these zones, and they've occupied these zones until American forces push them back. So this is right, or sorry, this is. Give me a sec here. So yeah, it was early, so it was late, on December 8th, the day after December 8th, and then going in through to up to March 1942 is they take Manila in the Philippines and down in Brunei in these areas. So yeah. Um, okay, next slide here. So Manchuria 1931. September 18, 1931, Japan launched an attack on Manchuria. Within a few days, Japanese armed forces had occupied several strategic points in South Manchuria. The United States Minister to China reported to Secretary of State Stimson in a telegram dated September 22nd his opinion that this was an aggressive act by Japan, apparently long planned and carefully and systematically put into effect. Minister Johnson found no evidence that it was the result of accident or the act of minor or irresponsible officials. He was convinced that the Japanese military operation in Manchuria must fall within any definition of war, and that this act of aggression had been deliberately accomplished in utter and cynical disregard of Japan's obligations under the Kellogg-Briand Pact of August 27th, 1928, for the reunification of war as an instrument of national policy. On September 27th, on September 22nd, Secretary Stimson informed Japanese Ambassador Dabushi at Washington that the responsibility for determining the course of events with regard to liquidating the situation in Manchuria rested largely upon Japan, for the simple reason that Japanese armed forces have seized and are exercising de facto control in South Manchuria. And here they are here. Meanwhile, the League of Nations was deliberating um, on the Manchuria situation. Secretary Stimson instructed the United States Council at Geneva to inform the Secretary General of the League of Nations in a communication dated October 5th, 1931, that it was most desirable that the League in no way relax its vigilance and in no way fail to assert all of its pressure and authority toward regulating the action of China and Japan. Secretary Simpson stated further that this government, acting independently, would endeavor to influence what the League does and would make clear its keen interest in the matter and its awareness of the obligations of the of the disputants in the Kilbride conflict or pact and the Nine Power Treaty. Should a time arise when it would seem advisable to bring forward these obligations, the United States government in identic notes, of course, October 20th, 1931, to China and Japan called attention to their obligations under the Kilbride Pact, which is a pact in 1928, a peaceful pact. This government expressed the hope that nations would refrain from measures which might lead to that they would agree upon a peaceful method for resolving their dispute in accordance with their promises and in keeping with expectations of public opinion throughout the world. So here, Japan has occupied Korea since 1910. You can see here in these Formosa 1895, Okinawa so 1887. So these are different areas of Japanese control. 1905, 1931 here, and of course Henan Island in 1939. And there's a lot more coming up here. So this sign here, you can see America has stood with China in this effort, including U.S. troops being on the ground in an expeditionary force um, to fight against Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and this is a protest. I'm not sure where. The Japanese government professed a desire to continue friendly relations with China and denied that it had territorial designs in Manchuria. However, Japanese military operations continued. By the end of 1931, Japan had destroyed the last remaining administrative authority of the government of the Chinese Republic in South Manchuria, as it existed prior to September 18th of that year. The United States government notified the Chinese and Japanese governments on January 7th, 1932, that it could not admit the legality of any situation de facto, nor did it intend to recognize any treaty or agreement entered into between these governments which might impair the treaty rights of the United States or its citizens in China. That it did not intend to recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement which might be brought about by means contrary to the obligations of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. In, pers- in pursuance of this policy, the puppet government established by Japanese arms in Manchuria a few weeks later has not been recognized by the United States. And so that's not the non-recognition policy from the United States. After the hostilities between Japan and China had spread to the Shanghai area early in 1932, the Japanese government asked that the United States extend its good offices for stopping hostilities. Thereupon, the United States made a proposal on February 2nd containing the following points: cessation of all acts of violence on both sides, no further preparation for hostilities, withdrawal of both Chinese and Japanese combatants in the Shanghai area, protection of the international settlement at Shanghai by the establishment of neutral ones, and upon acceptance of the foregoing, prompt negotiations to settle all outstanding controversies between Japan and China with the aid of neutral observers or participants. The same proposal was made to Japan and China by the British, French, and Italian governments. The Chinese government promptly accepted the proposal. The Japanese government, while accepting some of the points, rejected flatly the second and fifth points, and consequently the proposal came to no avail. In February 1932, Secretary of State Stimson proposed to the British government that the United States and British governments issue a joint statement invoking the Nine Power Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the Far Eastern controversy, making clear that the two governments considered these treaties as fully binding and declaring that they would not recognize as valid any situation created in violation of these treaties. In the letter of February 23rd, 1932, to Senator Bora, chairman of the Senate Committee for Foreign Relations, Secretary Stimson said that the situation which had developed in China could not be reconciled with the obligations set forth in the Nine Power Treaty and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. He referred to the statement of the United States government of January 7th and said that if a similar policy were followed by the other governments of the world, an effective bar would be placed on the legality of any title or right sought to be obtained by pressure or treaty violation, that eventually such action would lead to restoration to China of the rights and titles of which China had been deprived. The British government did not adopt the specific suggestion made by Secretary Stimson. Later, it introduced in the Assembly of the League of Nations a resolution which was unanimously adopted. This resolution was of March 11th, 1932, stated in part, "It is incumbent upon the members of the League of Nations not to recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement in which may be brought by means contrary to the covenant of the League of Nations or to the Pact of Paris." So anyway, this is a lot of the legality talk going back and forth between these operations and trying to cease hostilities. Um, so of course, the report, Ambassador Grove's report on Japanese military spirit. So the United States ambassador to Japan, Joseph C. Grew, reported to Senator Stimson, Secretary Stimson, on August 13th, 1932, the growing dangers in the existing situation. Ambassador Grow said that in Japan, the deliberate building up of public animosity against foreign nations in general, and the United States in particular, was for the purpose of strengthening the hand of the military in its Manchuria venture in the face of foreign opposition. He stated that the Japanese military machine had been building for war, felt prepared for war, and would welcome war, that it had never yet been beaten, and proposed unlimited self-confidence. Unlimited self-confidence. After consolidating their position in Manchuria, the Japanese military forces proceeded early in January 1933 to extend the boundaries of the new puppet state by the occupation of the province of Jeolla in North China. Jeolla. The Japanese ambassador in a conversation of January 5th with Secretary Stimson stated that Japan had no territorial ambition south of the Great Wall. The secretary reminded the ambassador that a year previously, the latter had said that Japan had no territorial ambitions in Manchuria. The ambassador replied that no Japanese cabinet which advocated a compromise on the Manchuria question could survive in Japan, and that the Manchuria incident must be regarded as closed. Secretary Stimson said that this government had not, that this government had come to the conclusion that another war, such as the World War, might destroy our civilization. Therefore, we were determined to support the peace machinery, which would render such a reoccurrence impossible. So here you can see, of course, from under Japanese rule since 1910. You can see here, of course, this is the invasion forward into Manchuria, Japanese occupation 31 and 32, and Japanese troops here. So the condemnation of Japanese aggression. Meanwhile, the League of Nations had been considering the report of the Leighton Commission, which had been appointed by the League to make an investigation of the situation in Manchuria. The commission reported that the military operations of the Japanese in Manchuria could not be regarded as measures of legitimate self-defense, that the regime which the Japanese had set up there disregarded the wishes of the people of Manchuria and was not compatible with the fundamental principles of existing international obligations. The League Assembly adopted this report on February 24, 1933, and the Japanese delegation thereupon walked out of the Assembly. In a letter of February 25th to the Secretary General of the League of Nations, Secretary Stimson stated that the United States was in substantial accord with the findings and conclusions of the League. On March 27, 1933, Japan gave notice of its intention to withdraw from the League. And of course, in spring of 1933, in connection with proposed legislation to authorize the President under certain conditions to apply embargoes on the export of arms from the United States, consideration was given to the possibility of an arms embargo against Japan. And so that's America's trying to put pressure upon on Japan for the Chinese situation. So what Secretary of State Hull, is saying to the United States, to the Senate, and to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, is saying that an arms embargo would, in a sense, favor Japan because, of course, Japan did not produce Japan was not an important producer of arms with industry sufficient developed to supply its own needs. With producers of arms with industries sufficiently developed to supply its own needs, so that China would, and of course they could supply their own needs, but China can't. China is a major producer, China is not a major producer of arms, and they are required, or they're requiring a lot. Most of it, these commodities are imported. So Japan, it would favor Japan dramatically in this war. So that's why the proposed arms embargo legislation was not enacted. And it would go in favor of Japan. That an embargo directed against Japan alone would probably result in the seizure by the Japanese of arms intended for China. Thus ultimately decreasing China's supply of arms and increasing Japan's supply. It would not. So they had, of course, Japan has factories that are capable of supplying their forces on a regular basis, and of course, any arms embargo that would against China or Japan, it would certainly favor Japan if they did that. So of course, it wasn't. The embargo legislation was not enacted. So here we have Japanese lands, 1931, and so here, Formosa, which is now Taiwan, of course. So this is Korea here, Manchuria, Manchukuo. That was, of course, land taken 31, 33, land taken 37, 38. The mainland invasion for more down in the main body of China is, of course, 1937, 1938, which is Peking, the capital, and then, of course, Shanghai. And then, of course, land taken in 1940 is down here in French Indochina, Vietnam, and those areas, Cambodia. So those are, and then, of course, the Mariana Islands as well, of course, that were owned by Japanese forces in 1931. And so this is some of the timeline, of course. So Japan, we've talked about all these up here. Um, so Japan leaves the League of Nations March 27th. 1934, Kazuyuki Okada becomes prime minister. Japan withdraws from the Washington Naval Treaty, and I will talk about that. Coup d'etat, the February 26th incident, crushed by Hirohito, which, Koki Hirota becomes prime minister. Japan signs its first pact with Germany, which is November 25th, and occupies Zhengzhou in China. Manchurian established in Inner Mongolia, so they take up areas in Inner Mongolia. 1937, Senichiro Hayashi becomes prime minister. Of course, so the prime minister changed relatively quickly once the military are taking a stronger strides in taking control of the entire country, or taking over the civilian role, or rendering it almost, in a sense, powerless. Prince Kano from Amaro becomes prime minister. So whatever they're not satisfied with, the military are making it very difficult for prime ministers to stay in power. The Sino-Japanese War starts with the Battle of the Lago Bridge. Japan captures Peking, the capital. Japanese troops occupy Nanking in the beginning of the Nanking Massacre. That's in 37. 38, Battle of Tishrang. March 24th, Canton falls to Japanese forces. 39. Hiromuno Kichiro becomes prime minister, January 5th. Japanese forces suffer a military defeat at the Battle of Kaigangal against Soviet forces. I'll talk about that. Abe Nobuyuki becomes prime minister August 30th, 1940. Mutsumasa Yoni becomes prime minister. Kono becomes prime minister for a second term. Talk more about that. So then there's on the 27th of July, or sorry, that's Kono. 100 regiments offensive. So August to September. Japan occupies French Indochina in the wake of the fall of Paris to the Germans, and signs the Tripartite Pact, sorry, September 27th. 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, and of course, April 13th, Hokkaido Tojo becomes prime minister and a major war leader for Japan during the Second World War. October 18th, Japanese naval forces attack. Tojo becomes prime minister on October 18th, 1941. And of course, December 7th, 1941 is when Japanese forces attack Pearl Harbor, and America declares war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. And then, of course, Japan conquers Hong Kong, which is on December 25th. And so more of this will come up. In Geneva, in 33, the Japanese delegation defined world opinion, which withdrew from the League of Nations Assembly today after the Assembly had adopted a report blaming Japan for events in Manchuria. So the stunned international conclave representing almost every nation on The planet sat in silence while the delegation led by Adepa Yosuke Matsuoka, clad in black, walked from the hall. The crowded galleries broke into mingled hisses and applause. Japan's formal resignation from the League is expected to be filed later on, and this is just the news update from that. The Japanese delegation stalked um, from the hall while a translator interpreted Matsuoka's speech. Matsuoka, usually typifying the placid Oriental diplomat, of course, was nervous before he began his speech and abandoned the text before he finished. Uh, he shouted from the rostrum, Japan will oppose any attempt at international control of Manchuria. It does not mean that we defy you, because Manchuria belongs to us by right. Read your history. We recovered Manchuria from Russia. We made it what it is today. And so he refers that, and that's what he states at the League of Nations. Um, he referred to Russia as well as China as a cause for deep and anxious concern for Japan. We look into the gloom of the future and can see no certain gleam of light before us. And that's what he declares. So, of course, he reiterates that Manchuria was a matter of life and death for Japan and that no concession or compromise was possible, saying Japan has been and will always be the mainstay of peace, order, and progress in the Far East. Objecting to proposed international control of Manchuria, he asked, would the American people agree to such control of the Panama Canal zone? Would the British permit it over Egypt? So, and Japanese people will oppose any such attempt in Manchuria. I beg of this body to release the facts and see a vision for the future of the future. I earnestly beg of you to deal with us in our terms, to give us your confidence. To deny us the appeal will be a mistake. I ask you not to adopt this report. And that's what he said earnestly. So, of course, here, them leaving the League of Nations, Japs get out of the League. So the Washington Naval Treaty, this is also known as the Five Power Treaty, was a treaty signed during 1922 along with the major nations that had won World War I, which agreed to prevent an arms race by limiting naval construction. It was negotiated at the Washington Naval Conference as the Washington Naval Conference held in Washington D.C. in November 1921 and February 1922, and it was signed by the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States, France, Italy, and Japan. It limited the construction of battleships, battlecruisers, aircraft carriers by the signatories. The number of other categories of warships, including cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, were not limited by the treaty, but those ships were limited to 10,000 tons displacement each, which is the size of a modern cruiser today, or a large destroyer. The treaty was concluded on February 6, 1922. Ratifications of that treaty were exchanged in Washington on August 17, 1923, and it was registered in the League of Nations Treaty Series in 1924. Later naval arms limitation conferences sought additional limitations of warships building. The terms of the Washington Treaty were modified by the London Naval Treaty of 1930 and the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936. So they were modified in those two treaties. By the mid-1930s, Japan and Italy renounced the treaties, while Germany renounced the Treaty of Versailles, which had limited its navy. So Japan and Germany were building up, as well as Italy, and planning on building up. Naval arms limitation became increasingly difficult for the other signatories. So here it is in Washington. Here's some battle cruisers here, and construction of some of the battle cruisers from the United States Navy, I believe. Battleships, and this is USS Delaware being scrapped in accordance with the Washington Naval Treaty. So interesting how these treaties, much like the arms treaties of today, limiting landmines or cluster bombs, outlawing them, um, under, of course, a Geneva Convention on the rules of war, as well as the START Treaty or the START Onward treaties, what they call now the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks on limiting nuclear weapons. Um, we have no limits on, in a sense of limiting our major powers' warships today, but the naval treaty had a profound effect on the Japanese. With superior American and British industrial power, a long war would very likely end in a Japanese defeat. Thus, gaining strategic parity was not economically possible. Many Japanese considered the 5-5-3 ratio of ships as another snub by the West, though it can be argued that the Japanese had a greater force concentration than the U.S. Navy or the Royal Navy. Um, it also contributed to controversy in high ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy between the treaty faction officers and their fleet faction opponents, who were also allied with the ultranationalists of the Japanese army and other parts of the Japanese government. For the treaty faction, the treaty was one of the factors that contributed to the deterioration of the relationship between the United States and Japanese governments in the 30s. And some have also argued that the treaty was one major factor in prompting Japanese expansionism by the fleet faction during the early 1930s. The perception of unfairness resulted in Japan's renunciation of the Second London Naval Treaty in 1936. And this is where they're building up their carriers, their battleships, their um, different, of course, cruisers and then destroyers and submarines as well. And here it is here. Isayoko Yamamoto, um, who later masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto argued that Japan should remain in the treaty. His opinion was more complex, however, in that he believed the United States could outproduce Japan by a greater factor than the 5-3 ratio because of the huge U.S. population or U.S. production advantage of which he had expert knowledge since he had served with the Japanese embassy in Washington. After the signing of the treaty, he commented, anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the power for a naval race with America. He later added, the ratio works very well for Japan. It is a treaty to restrict the other parties. He believed that other methods than a spree of construction would be needed to even the odds, which may have contributed to his advocacy of a plan to attack Pearl Harbor. On December 29, 1934, the Japanese government gave formal notice that it intended to terminate the treaty. Its provisions remained in force formally until the end of 1936 and were not renewed. So here's when they are renouncing of the naval treaty. February 26th incident. It was organized by a group of young Imperial Japanese Army officers with the goal of purging the government and military leadership of their factional rivals and ideological opponents. Although the um, rebels succeeded in assassinating several leading officials, including two former prime ministers, and occupying the government center of Tokyo, they failed to assassinate Prime Minister Kaitsuki Okada or secure control of the imperial palace. Their supporters in the army made attempts to capitalize on their actions. But divisions within the military, combined with imperial anger at the coup, meant they were unable to achieve unable to achieve a change in government. Facing overwhelming opposition as the army moved against them, the rebels surrendered on 29th February. Unlike earlier examples of political violence by young officers. The coup attempt had several consequences. After a series of closed trials, 19 of the uprising's leaders were executed for mutiny and another 40 imprisoned. The radical Kuroha faction lost its influence within the army. The period of government by assassination came to a close, and the military increased its control over the civilian government. The Marco Polo Bridge incident happened the next year, and that's another incident. Um, Hayashi Sinduro, in 1931, as the commander of Japanese troops in Korea, Hayashi ordered his forces to march into Manchuria, beginning the Japanese encroachment into China. This is one of the top generals that culminated in World War II in the Pacific. Of course, this course was leading into the Second World War. Eventually, the action was undertaken without permission of the government in Tokyo. Hayashi was promoted to full general in 1932. In 1934, he succeeded General Araki Sadao as Minister of War and attempting to purge the army's Iraqi supporters, Iraqi supporters, um, who had strong fascist leanings. He succeeded in removing an estimated 5,000 officers from important posts. After his resignation in 1935, he took a position on the Supreme War Council, from which he resigned the following year. He actually became prime minister in February 1937 and tried to create a cabinet that was above the factional strife of the political parties. To this end, he demanded that members of his cabinet renounce their party ties. Finally, after only a few months in office, he threw government support behind the Shawakai pro-militarist party. Um, so he he dissolved the Diet Parliament and called a general election, hoping to establish a one-party country. The general election revealed that he had few supporters and was forced to resign. So again, there's a lot of power struggle going on in Imperial Japan, a lot more than what a lot of people see. Certainly, the main power struggles are from the military hierarchy and the civilian government, and as well as the military trying to force upon its will on the civilian government, and of course, failures of the civilian governments and leading to prime ministers being resigning and whatnot and continuing on. So the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to the end of the Second World War. It was a military conflict that was primarily waged between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. In China, the war was known as the War of Resistance Against the Japanese Aggression, or as the Oriental Theater of the World Anti-Fascist War, the later term originating from Mao Zedong's wartime alliance with Stalin. The beginning of the war is conventionally dated to the Marco Polo Bridge incident on 7th of July 1937, when a dispute between Japanese and Chinese troops in Peking escalated into a full-scale invasion. This full-scale war between the Chinese and the Empire of Japan is often regarded as the beginning of World War II in Asia. In 2017, the Ministry of Education in the People's Republic of China decreed that the term 8-year war in all textbooks should be replaced by 14-year war, with a revised starting date of September 18th, 1931, provided by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And that's certainly the more of the authoritarian regime in China, of course, with the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping's forces in his strengthening of China's military today, and its more authoritarian beliefs, certainly within the Chinese sphere of influence, and according to South China Sea today, certainly that's one reason why they're pushing more on the propaganda front as well, and that's so. And according to historian Rana Mitter, historians in China are unhappy with the blanket revision, and despite sustained tensions, the Republic of China did not consider itself to be continuously at war with Japan for over these 6 years. You have Japanese soldiers with, believe, Type 99 light machine guns, either Type 26 or Type 99, uh, which are basically very similar to the British brand guns, 7.7 millimeter uh, machine guns, 20 round magazines. Here you can here's see soldiers, Japanese Imperial Japanese soldiers cheering from one victory here. China fought Japan with aid from the Soviet Union and the United States after the Japanese attacks on Malaya and Pearl Harbor in 1941, which I'll talk to later on. The war merged with other conflicts, which are generally categorized under those conflicts of World War II as a major sector known as the China, Burma, India theater. Some scholars consider the European War and the Pacific War to be entirely separate, albeit concurrent wars. Other scholars consider the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 to have been the beginning of World War II. And certainly, in our sphere of influences, as you guys know, our sphere of influence, the beginning of World War II happens on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland and the Blitzkrieg of Poland, and that's technically how it starts for us. These are theaters of war that have been going on for since 31, and were not considered part of the full war sphere of operations until Japan had declared war on United States. Not until, and that's in our way of thinking, but in a sense that these are major conflicts that were already going on as Germany was building up and preparing to go to war in 39. So it's all part of the technical connection. Um, in it all depends on which scholar you ask. Some say it's 37, some say it's 39 with Poland, but these, of course, this will certainly, once Japan declares war on the United States, then you have the full unraveling of the total World War II. And so, and that is December 7th and December 8th, 1941. And but America has already been involved with um, China, but of course, and but they were not involved against um, Germany until Chamberlain, and then of course Winston Churchill was asking for American supplies and help in neutral supplies, which is from the Lend-Lease Agreement in 1940 and onwards. So, it's at different times where it unravels into full-scale war, but it all leads to the full-scale war, which is World War II. So this is China, 1937, 1938. Um, and it spread through invasion, August and October 1937, and pushing through to Nanjing and the massacre of Nanjing, and Chinese retreat in early 38 through to Wuhan, Chongzhou, Chongquan, sorry, in 1938 October, and Kaifeng in Hexu, so Hangzhou, May 1938. So these are This is the progression of Japanese forces in a major offensive in the Second Sino-Japanese War in its full entirety of the main body after Manchuria, starting in 1937. So this is basically a map showing China 1900 to 1949. So China as its main body as seen similar to what it is today, and this is of course the Japanese occupation in 1940 is this orange section here, and of course and they have Taiwan. They also have Hainan Island in 1940, I believe. And so this here is a map from 1940. On the night of 7th July 1937, Chinese and Japanese troops exchanged fire in the vicinity of the Marco Polo or Lugu Bridge, crucial access route to Beijing. What began as confused, sporadic skirmishing soon escalated into a full-scale battle in which Beijing and its port city of Tianjin fell to Japanese forces on July and August 1937. On 29th July, some 5,000 troops of the 1st and 2nd Corps of the East Hopai Army mutinied, turning against the Japanese garrison. In addition to Japanese military personnel, some 260 civilians living in Changzhou, in accordance with the Boxer Protocol of 1901, were killed in the uprising, predominantly Japanese, um, including the police force and also some ethnic Koreans. The Chinese then set fire to and destroyed much of the city. Only around 60 Japanese civilians survived, um, who provided both journalists and later historians with first-hand witness accounts. Japanese civilians, so that were there in wow, only around so. As a result of the violence of the mutiny against Japanese civilians, the Changchao Mutiny strongly shook public opinion within Japan. So here are some of the Chinese troops under Chiang Kai-shek, I believe, and armed with M1938 Thompson, U.S. Thompson submachine guns, 45 ACP caliber ammunition, 20 round mags. Here you have, of course, Japanese soldiers moving in. That's an actual um, color photograph of either Beijing or Shanghai. I'm not sure, but or maybe Tianjin. The Imperial General Headquarters, GHQ, in Tokyo, content with the gains acquired in northern China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, initially showed reluctance to escalate the conflict into full-scale war. The KMT, however, determined that the breaking point of Japanese aggression had been reached. So Chiang Kai-shek quickly mobilized the central government's army and air force, placed them under his direct command, and laid siege to the Japanese area of Shanghai International Settlement, where 30,000 Japanese civilians lived, with 30,000 troops on 12th of August 1937. On 13th of August 1937, Kuomintang soldiers and warplanes attacked Japanese marine positions in Shanghai, leading to the Battle of Shanghai. On the 14th of August, Kuomintang planes accidentally bombed the Shanghai International Settlement, which led to more than 3,000 civilian deaths. In the 3 days from 14th of August to 16th, 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent many sorties of then advanced long-range G3M Betty medium-range land-based bombers and assorted carrier-based aircraft, high-level bombers, dive bombers maybe, with the expectation of destroying the Chinese Air Force. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy encountered unexpected resistance from the defending Chinese Curtiss Hawk II, Hawk III, and P-26 281 Peashooter fighter squadrons, suffering heavy 50% losses from the defending Chinese pilots. 14th of August was subsequently commemorated by the KMTs as China's Air Force Day. So they took a lot of they forced some heavy firepower and drew a lot of blood from the Imperial Japanese Navy's sorties. Look at the numbers here, amazing, eh? And of course, some of the equipment. The Chinese soldiers, of course, had German helmets, and certainly in somewhat they were equipped with even Mausers from Germany at the time, and amazing. So Chinese nationalists, including regional warlords, centralized nationalist Air Force of China, Nine, 1.7 million, 1937, 2.6 million, 1939. By 1945, 5.7 million. Wow. The Chinese Communists, 40,000 in 1937 under Mao Zedong. 1938, 166,700. 488,000 1940. 1.2 million in 1945. So the Japanese forces there in mainland China, whatnot. So 600,000 1937, over a million 1939, and 1,124,000 in 1945, excluding Manchuria and the Burma campaign. So that's another campaign I'll cover later on. So here we have the Betty bombers of the either Japanese Imperial Japanese Air Force or Imperial Japanese Navy, um, G3M bombers. Um, these are medium bombers, and of course the Zero here. So that's what the picture is of the Zero, the six. There, sorry, the A6M0. Now, its first flight was actually in April 1st, 1939, and introduction in July 1940. So this aircraft was absolutely became famous in the Battle of Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, Produced from 1939 to 1945, 10,939. Amazing. So, of course, this is a very long range fighter aircraft, notorious fighter aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And it's also was frequently used, and I'll talk a lot more about it as the time goes in different presentations. It's frequently used as a land based fighter as well. Very capable, very maneuverable. Um, so the variants, there's Nakajima A6M2N for the Navy. It's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries that makes it. It's a very capable fighter, and this is so that's just some more of the information on the Zero, and that will be used later on in the War with China and onward. So talking from 38, 39, right? We're covering that basis now.